It was a quiet afternoon when the black man stepped outside to close his driveway gate. He had just finished some yard work, a peaceful task that brought him comfort after a long week at work. As he carefully slid the metal gate across, securing his home from the world outside, he didn't expect anything more than a brief moment of solitude. But as he began walking back to his porch, his peace was abruptly shattered. From across the street, a woman's voice pierced the air. "What do you think you're doing?" she yelled, her words sharp and accusing. The woman, who had been standing near her front door, was now glaring at him with a look of confusion mixed with indignation. At first, he thought she might be addressing someone else, but as her gaze locked onto him, the truth became clear: she was talking to him. He paused for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Was she asking about the gate? He was on his own property, just closing it. But her tone, filled with suspicion and judgment, told a different story. The woman's face twisted into a scowl, and she quickly reached for her phone. "You're blocking the road. You're acting suspicious, and I don't feel safe with you here," she barked into the phone, her voice rising in volume. A chill ran down his spine as the words, "blocking the road," echoed in his mind. He was in no way obstructing traffic. His driveway was a private space, and he hadn't even been there for more than a few minutes. His home, his sanctuary, was under attack, not by anything or anyone physical, but by the sharp sting of racism disguised as concern. His heart raced as the woman continued to speak into her phone, and before he knew it, he heard the unmistakable sound of a 911 call being made. "Yes, officer, there's a man on my street acting suspiciously. He's on his property, but I'm really uncomfortable with how he's been behaving," she said, her words dripping with an unspoken accusation. The black man stood there, processing what was happening. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but the thought of someone calling the police on him simply for closing a gate was unsettling. It didn't seem to matter that he was doing nothing wrong. It didn't matter that he was on his own land. To her, he was the problem. Minutes later, he saw the flashing lights of a police car pull into the neighborhood. His stomach sank as he realized that his worst fear was unfolding. He was about to be treated like a suspect in his own life, all because of an unfounded accusation. The woman had already started pacing in front of her house, gesturing toward him, her face now twisted in a mixture of fear and satisfaction. He didn't move. He stood still, trying to remain calm, though the situation felt surreal. He had lived in this neighborhood for years, paid taxes, and been a quiet, law-abiding citizen. Yet here he was, on the receiving end of an overzealous call, one that had the potential to escalate into something far worse. He had no idea what the police officer would think when they arrived, but in that moment, all he could do was hold his ground and hope that the truth would be enough. The police officer pulled up in front of the black man's house with a squeal of tires. It wasn't an emergency vehicle, but it was a marked patrol car, the officer behind the wheel wearing the standard uniform and a no-nonsense expression on his face. He parked and stepped out, his boots clicking against the pavement as he made his way toward the scene. The woman, eager to explain, rushed over, pointing a finger at the black man. The officer's attention was initially split between the woman and the man, who remained standing by the gate. The woman, clearly frustrated, wasted no time in launching into her version of events. "Officer, this man has been acting suspiciously. I don't feel safe with him here, and he's blocking the road," she said, her voice sharp and insistent. The officer glanced at the black man, who stood calmly with his hands by his sides, waiting for the chance to explain. The man's gaze met the officer's, and the officer took a moment to assess him. He wasn't acting out of line. His posture was relaxed, and there was no aggression in his demeanor. The officer's eyes then shifted to the gate, now fully closed. No cars were blocking the street, no road was obstructed. Everything appeared normal. With a deep breath, the officer turned toward the woman, his voice firm yet polite. "Ma'am, you need to leave this man's property. He's not doing anything wrong. He's simply closing his gate. You can't make accusations without cause," he said, his tone calm but resolute. The woman faltered for a moment, her face flushing red. she stammered, as if struggling to come up with another excuse, but the officer wasn't having it. I understand you're concerned, but there's no reason to make a scene. Please go back to your house and stop disturbing this man's peace, he added. The woman, clearly irritated, crossed her arms but ultimately took a few steps back. She muttered something under her breath, but she didn't argue any further. With a huff, she turned and walked away, storming toward her house as she shot one last angry look at the black man. As the officer watched her retreat, he turned back to the black man. Sorry about that, he said, his voice a little more relaxed. Some people they like to make a big deal out of nothing. You've got every right to be here. I'll make sure things stay quiet from here on out. The black man nodded, still feeling the sting of the unfair accusation but grateful for the officer's level-headed response. Thanks, he muttered, though his mind wasn't fully at ease. The officer gave him a brief nod before walking back to his car, signaling the end of the interaction. As the officer drove away, the black man's heart was still heavy, but he tried to shake the feeling that had lodged itself deep in his chest. It was over, at least for now. Or so he thought. The incident had left a bitter taste in the black man's mouth. Though the officer had resolved the matter without any further trouble, something about the woman's unfounded accusations continued to gnaw at him. His property, his space, had been challenged simply because of who he was. It was a frustration that lingered in the air like smoke, suffocating the peaceful moment he had once enjoyed. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the woman's behavior than just an isolated outburst. Maybe it was his intuition, or maybe it was the insult of being wrongly accused for something he hadn't done, but he couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. That night, after a dinner that barely satisfied him, he sat down at his computer. As the world outside went silent, he dove into the task of learning more about her. She had been so quick to call the cops, to stir up a situation out of nothing. She had tried to make him feel like a trespasser in his own home, but now, it was his turn to dig into her life. He started with a search of her name, the name she had so proudly spoken into the phone earlier. He was meticulous, entering every possible variation and detail he could remember from their brief exchange. Her name wasn't uncommon, but it didn't take long for him to stumble upon something interesting, an old news article about her family. It wasn't about her directly, but it mentioned her ancestors, individuals who had lived in the area long before her. The more he dug, the clearer the picture became. This woman's family had deep roots in the community, but those roots weren't as pure as she might have liked to believe. The search led him down a winding rabbit hole. Records, old local news stories, and public archives painted a picture he hadn't expected to find. As he pieced the information together, his heart sank. The woman's ancestors had been prominent members of a local Ku Klux Klan chapter in the 1950s, a chapter notorious for their violent actions and hateful rhetoric. The deeper he dug, the more it became evident that her family had been at the heart of some of the worst racist incidents in the town's history. They weren't just bystanders, they had been active participants in an era defined by division, hate, and oppression. His fingers froze over the keyboard as the full weight of the revelation hit him. He had uncovered a disturbing connection between the woman and her family's legacy of racism, one that explained her hostile reaction to him earlier. She wasn't just an angry neighbor, she was, in some ways, the product of a hateful history. It was hard for him to accept that something as innocuous as closing his gate could trigger such a response, but the puzzle pieces had clicked into place. He sat back in his chair, feeling a rush of mixed emotions, anger, disgust, and disbelief. But above all, there was something else, resolve. He wasn't going to let this slide. She had called the police on him for no reason, treating him like a criminal just because of who he was, and now he had the ammunition to expose her for what she was. But he wasn't going to just tell her. He was going to confront her in a way that would make her face the truth of her own family's past. The black man spent the next few days preparing. Armed with the damning information he had uncovered, he felt more determined than ever to confront the woman. His plan was simple. He would confront her about her family's legacy and make her aware that he knew the truth. If she thought she could accuse him without consequences, she was about to be proven wrong. He waited for the right moment. The woman's house was still in the neighborhood, just across the street from his. He saw her coming and going, her routine unchanged by the events that had unfolded. The black man knew he couldn't let the moment pass. It wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about holding her accountable for the hate she had inherited, and possibly, for the hate she still carried. But when the confrontation finally came, it didn't unfold as he had expected. Before he could approach her, he saw the police lights flashing in his rearview mirror. Another squad car had arrived, and this time, the woman was standing on her front lawn, her arms flailing dramatically. She had called the cops again, but this time, it wasn't for a blocked driveway, or suspicious behavior. This time, she was making a far more serious claim. She accused him of threatening her. The officer, unfamiliar with the previous incident, approached with caution, his hand hovering near his holster. "What's going on?" he asked, his eyes flicking back and forth between the woman and the black man, who stood in his own driveway. The woman didn't hesitate. "He's been harassing me for days. He's come to my property, yelled at me, and I'm scared for my safety. He's threatened me." Her voice quivered, but there was an edge to it, something calculated. The black man felt a surge of frustration. She was lying. Her accusations were unfounded, and they had no basis in reality. But the police officer didn't know that. His eyes narrowed as he took a step closer to the black man. "What happened this time?" the officer asked, his tone now cautious. "I haven't threatened her," the black man replied, his voice steady. "She's lying. I've been trying to mind my own business. The only thing I did was research her family, and I found some pretty unsettling things about her ancestry." The officer blinked, clearly confused. "What do you mean? What's this about her family?" The black man took a deep breath, prepared to explain everything: the research, the clan ties, the deep-rooted racism in her bloodline. But before he could say another word, the woman screamed, her face red with fury. "Lies! All lies!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with emotion. Then, without warning, she lunged at the officer. Her hand shot out, slapping him across the face in a fit of rage. The officer staggered back, stunned, as she shrieked, "I don't want to hear any more of his lies!" In the blink of an eye, the officer regained his composure and grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back. "You're under arrest for assaulting an officer," he declared, his voice hard and final. The black man watched, stunned, as the woman was taken away in handcuffs, her accusations and anger rendered meaningless by her own actions. It was over, but the black man knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was a moment of justice, a brief but powerful correction of the wrongs done by a woman blinded by her own hate. The night was heavy with tension as the black man prepared himself for what he knew would be a defining moment. The confrontation wasn't just about clearing his name or calling out the woman's racism. It was about forcing her to confront the dark legacy she was so desperately trying to bury. Her actions, however subtle or overt, had stemmed from something deep within, and he now had the knowledge to expose it. The police car pulled into the driveway, the officer stepping out with his usual stoic expression. The black man had been waiting, his heart pounding with the anticipation of what he was about to say. The officer, not fully aware of the woman's behavior from their previous encounter, glanced between him and the woman, his expression one of mild confusion. Before the officer could speak, the black man took a deep breath and addressed the situation with the calmness that had served him so well in the past. "I know this seems like another complaint, but it's more than just that," he began, his voice steady, measured. "The reason she's been acting this way, accusing me without cause, is rooted in something much deeper than a simple misunderstanding. I did some research on her, and what I found shocked me." The officer, now paying closer attention, raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? What kind of research?" The black man continued, not hesitating for a second. "Her family has a dark history. They were deeply involved with the Ku Klux Klan. I found records linking them to violent acts and racial hatred, and I think it explains why she's treating me the way she has. It's not just an isolated incident. It's something that's been passed down through generations. I know this might sound unbelievable, but I'm not making it up." The officer's eyes widened in disbelief as he processed the words. He had never suspected anything like this, but now the pieces were starting to fall into place. He turned to the woman, who had been standing there, trembling with anger. Her face flushed red, and her eyes darted nervously between the officer and the black man. She had no idea that her history, a history she had long tried to ignore or hide, was now coming to light. "Is this true?" the officer asked, his voice steady but now tinged with suspicion. The woman, her mouth opening and closing in a mixture of fury and disbelief, took a step forward. "I don't know what he's talking about," she hissed, her fists clenched by her sides. "This is ridiculous. I'm not responsible for what my ancestors did. He's just trying to ruin my life because of something I can't control." But the black man wasn't finished. "Maybe you can't control your ancestors, but you can control how you act. And this behavior, calling the cops on me over nothing, accusing me of things I haven't done, this is you. This is the hate passed down through your family. It's alive and well in you, even if you can't see it." The woman's face twisted in a mix of embarrassment, anger, and shame, but it was her rage that overtook her. With a sudden, violent motion, she rushed forward and swung her fist, connecting with the officer's face. The blow wasn't just a simple slap or push, it was an outburst of pure fury. Her actions were not just a physical attack on the officer, they were a desperate attempt to suppress the truth she couldn't escape. The officer staggered back, surprised by the sudden violence. The black man watched in stunned silence as the woman's anger reached its boiling point. She wasn't just angry at him anymore, she was furious at the realization that her family's past had been exposed. It was a mistake she wouldn't recover from. The officer recovered quickly, his training kicking in as he regained his composure. He had been struck, but his response was swift and controlled. "You're under arrest for assaulting an officer," he said firmly, grabbing the woman's arm and twisting it behind her back. The woman, still caught up in her rage, fought back briefly, but the officer's hold was unyielding. She screamed, her face contorted with anger and disbelief. "You can't do this! You don't know what he's been doing! He's lying! All of it's a lie!" she shouted, her voice becoming more frantic with every passing second. But it was too late. The officer had already read her the rights, and he wasn't about to let her get away with her actions. She was handcuffed and led to the squad car, her protests growing fainter as she was taken away. The black man stood by, watching the entire scene unfold before his eyes. For a brief moment, he felt a strange mix of relief and satisfaction. Justice, in a twisted way, had been served. As the woman was placed in the back of the squad car, her eyes wide with disbelief, she seemed to fully realize the weight of what had just happened. Her outburst had sealed her fate. Not only had she assaulted an officer, but she had also been exposed as a product of the very hate she had tried to deny. The black man couldn't help but feel a sense of finality in the air. Her actions had finally caught up with her, and the consequences had come crashing down. She had thought she could get away with her lies, with her hatred, without facing any real repercussions. But the truth had a way of catching up with people like her, no matter how far they tried to bury it. As the squad car pulled away, the black man stood there, his chest rising and falling with the slow rhythm of the moment. He had done more than just defend himself. He had exposed the woman's truth, her history of hate, and made sure she couldn't deny it anymore. It was the kind of justice that went beyond the courtroom, beyond the police report. It was the kind of justice that said the past could be revealed, and that no one, no matter their privilege or status, could escape the consequences of their actions. He watched the car disappear down the street, feeling a quiet, deep sense of justice settle into his bones. The weight that had been on his shoulders for days, the burden of dealing with someone who had wronged him for no reason other than his race, had finally been lifted. He didn't need to do anything more. The woman had made sure her own fate was sealed.